Today on the Relationship Revival Show, we're talking to Madylynn Snyder. Maddie is a licensed marriage and family therapist working in private practice in Los Angeles. She specializes in working with neurodivergent individuals and couples, and she's also an adjunct professor of psychology at Azusa Pacific University in their master's counseling program. Maddie was brought to the field of psychology by her own experiences of mental illness within her family growing up. Her experience of having a parent that struggled with mental health provided her with insight about the need for mental health services in communities that are underserved. Maddie's currently interested in exploring mental health challenges in high-masking individuals. You're listening to the Relationship Revival Podcast with John DeBach, also known as Mr. Spirituality. That's me. I'm your host, giving you insights and guidance from over 10 years in the field of this amazing journey we call romance. On this show, I go over everything you need to know about how to get into a relationship, how to get the most out of a relationship, and sometimes even how to gracefully end a relationship without pulling your hair out and going crazy. And occasionally, I'm even joined by new and old friends who are also relationship experts to bring you guidance and wisdom with new perspectives. Thanks for stopping by. Maddie Snyder, thank you so much for joining.
Hi there. Good to be here with you today, and I'm looking forward to talking.
Me too. And I think, right off the bat, you had a pretty interesting upbringing where you dealt with some stuff that makes you particularly qualified to kind of talk from a first-person experience of what some of that trauma looks like. Can you, fill everybody in, walk us through what experience you had growing up, how that informed you as a therapist?
Yeah, it's obviously a huge part of what brought me to therapy. And I sometimes have like the elevator pitch version of this or like longer version.
Give me the long version.
So
I want to hear the details.
We'll give you the longer version
Yeah.
and we'll get into it. So part of, my upbringing is that when I was a teenager, I had a parent who was diagnosed with pretty severe mental illness, my mother. And so the area that we lived in, where I grew up, is Central Valley of California. It's not usually what people think of when they think of California as far as like the beach and,
sunshine
celebrity and all
right.
that. Exactly. It's a little bit different. I grew up kind of in the country. And so there's a lot of things that are unique to that part of California. But one of the things mental health wise is that it didn't feel like there was a ton of accessibility to find therapists or access to mental health care. I think at the time, the closest therapist that we could find for my mom was like an hour away. 45 minutes to an hour. So the next town over. Yeah. So if you're like, working all day long, you have to either like take a day off or you have to go after work. And then that's a whole 2-hour thing. So,
and it's obviously pre-Zoom and everything where you could actually.
Exactly. Pre-Zoom, pre any of that. So, now that's changed a lot for that area. But, particularly like when I grew up, our family's kind of navigating this whole mental health crisis for the first time. It's not something, this was years ago, so there's not as many resources. Therapy is just kind of starting to be destigmatized. There's a lot that we're working up against as far as like resources available to us. I think at the time when she was diagnosed, she was hospitalized and the hospital was like an hour away. Oof. And then was transferred to a place that was like in Ventura that was like 3 hours away. Yeah. So that's the kind of climate that we're looking at.
How old were you when this happened, when the diagnosis?
I was about 13 years old.
So
I was pretty young.
Age, yeah.
It was really pivotal. And if you think about, I was going from 8th grade to high school. You're in a small town. So it's not like there is some big, huge public announcement, but everyone kind of knows that this is going on within our family. My mom was a pretty prominent figure within our community. And so it was a lot happening at once. She was also really highly productive. So it was really shocking for people because, again, she was an art teacher. Oh, okay. So she taught at all the elementary schools. So a lot of times, like, I would go to high school and everyone's like, we all know your mom. Yeah. She's great. Everyone called her Mrs. Snyder, kind of like a play on her last name. So, that was, there's a lot of dynamics there as far as like she was highly productive and also struggling pretty severely. She had bipolar disorder and psychosis. And there's a number of other diagnoses thrown out there. Yeah.
And back then, bipolar wasn't really super well researched and well understood, even in the psychiatric community. The medications available were pretty minimal. I think lithium was probably the only thing available. Yeah. There's weight gain and other issues that come up when you take that.
Exactly. So then you have to deal with like self-esteem issues as well, pretty
Lethargic
drastic changes
nature of
within
it.
your body.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she's like a mom of 3 kids too.
That's rough.
So there's
Yeah.
a ton of, there's like so much there to unpack. And getting into grad school, I'm kind of like the holder of all the family heirlooms. I like doing all the family history.
Are you the oldest? Where are you in the pecking order?
I'm in the middle.
I'm a middle child too.
Yeah. So I got that vibe from you. You get it. You understand.
Yeah.
And I kind of have taken a different route than my siblings, and we could, talk about that down the line.
Sure.
But I'm kind of, definitely I'm pretty true to like all the theories around middle children, I would say.
I'm not actually. It's one of those areas
really?
I like stayed away from. So maybe, I just selfishly, I'd love to hear about it, but later.
Yeah.
So,
that's probably how our conversation is going to go. We're going to start talking and be like, oh, and that's interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll try to stay on task.
So what?
But yeah.
So your mom got diagnosed and she spent some time in the hospital. What happened next?
So there was a bunch of different diagnoses at the time. So part of like when this is going to tie in, I promise, but part of like when I got to grad school, my dad gave me this box of all of her medical records. So now as a clinician looking through this, I had like a completely different understanding, of what was happening. Cause there was like major depressive diagnosis, this has schizophrenia diagnosis, bipolar, with these different, hospitals and clinicians. Everyone's kind of has a different theory on it.
Yeah.
The prognosis at the time was not super positive. So they kind of said she's looking at a longer term hospitalization. She was in a facility for like 3 months and then was able to actually come home, which was not expected. So there was some new medications that were coming out at the time. They put her on some of them. They found something that worked for her. And she was able to come back home. And it didn't feel like as a family we had the tools to talk about it. And we weren't in family therapy at the time or any of that. And so it kind of felt like things just proceeded as normal. Like we had this huge thing happen and then it felt like, okay, let's just kind of pretend everything's okay and we'll keep chugging along. And I think that was her way of coping with her mental illness. I mean, because this didn't come out until she was in her late 40s. Yeah. She'd been struggling with depression pretty much her whole life.
Wow.
So that was kind of how things went from there.
Was there... And if I'm getting too personal, just, let me know. I'll back up. Was there trauma in her past that instigated it, or was it just kind of general undiagnosed depression?
There was some trauma, and a lot of that to me is unclear. As an adult, I have so many questions that I would ask now if she was still here. And so there was some childhood trauma as far as like talking with her siblings a little bit, talking with my dad. All of it is like through stories, right? Yeah. Because at the time I was in my teenage years, I didn't get a chance to hear.
So you're repiecing all the fragments that you hear third hand.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah. I feel like I could write like a whole book on this because it's just been such a journey of like, I was really close with my mom, and there's all these things now that I'd love to talk to her about, especially as a therapist trying to understand my own upbringing.
Right.
Yeah. So there was childhood trauma, and then even, she had some birth trauma, and things like that just really, I think, weighed on her over the years. I actually have all her diaries, so I've been working through those.
Oh, wow.
And it's really interesting to read some of the narratives of like times she was struggling.
That must be hard to read too.
Yeah, it's hard, and it's like connecting too, right? Because it's like, this is what I have left, and it kind of feels like a gift where I can read some of it. And it's just, seems like transitional low grade type depression. But it's been really healing in a way too.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so what you mentioned your mom's no longer with us. What happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she came home from the hospital. I was 13 or 14. Things were pretty good for a few years. And I don't have, I'm not entirely sure what was happening for her then. But when I was 17, she had for a while been struggling kind of with a relapse in her mental health diagnoses as far as like depression and bipolar, and had been experiencing some of those symptoms and went off of her medication.
Oh, that's
and then
that's rad. That's bad.
A lot of this, no one had any idea.
Yeah.
So she seemed fine to everyone. And then one day it was really unexpected. My dad and I got home and she had died by suicide. And so that was part of my own trauma history that I had to work through. Yeah. But that,
how old were you at the time?
I was 17 at the time. And so I was just a senior in high school. And I had been, luckily I'd gotten through, that whole high school experience with along with like her mental illness, was my own anxiety.
Yeah.
Right. Knowing that this is a possibility, because when she got diagnosed, I became really interested in psychology. So I know, like, with depression, this is a risk. So for me, it felt like obviously soul crushing for everyone, but it's been really interesting to see the different parts of it, my specific trauma surrounding being there when she died, versus my siblings and me having to call and tell them about it, different experiences. And so there's a lot we could talk about there too, as far as suicide particularly is hard for people to understand. And having a parent who dies by suicide is different than like cancer, where people kind of know. And there's
please tell me more about that. I don't know a lot about it. Thankfully, I don't have a lot of experiences, but I'm sure there are going to be people who listen to it who might know a friend or might be scared if they have someone in their family with a mental illness. And I think talking about this and shining more light on it is beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, I think it is super important. And that's why I talk about this as much as I can, and obviously try to do that tactfully. Because again, it's just a hard topic for people to understand and to talk about. But I think part of what I've learned about losing a parent to suicide is if you've had the experience of losing a loved one, when you tell someone like, oh yeah, I lost a parent, right? Already people are kind of on edge. They're like, usually want to say something like, oh, I'm so sorry. And then you kind of feel like you're having to be like, oh, no, it's okay. Or yeah, it really sucks. And you have to kind of figure out how much of that can they hold or not.
Right.
But already having lost a parent at a young age, people are kind of like, ugh, I'm not sure how to navigate the conversation around this. If they, haven't had conversations like this before or experienced a loss themselves. But even further than that, when you say you have a parent who died by suicide, then people really struggle to know what to say, right? And then you're put in this position of having to try to feel, you're feeling the uncomfortability, they're feeling it, and then you're like trying to wrap it up with a nice bow, right? So that it feels more comfortable.
Reprocess all your own grief. You then have to educate them on the social etiquette of what to do next because they're at loss.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, wait, you're supposed to be comforting me here, right?
And you're 17 to boot, it's
exactly.
Like, that's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And at 17, oh my gosh, people do not, kids don't know how to talk about it, right? And so I think a lot of my friends' strategy was like, let's just distract her and we'll just have fun. But I felt just really lonely during that time because, I'm helping out at home more. I had a younger brother. My dad was at home still. And so, just being more at home, helping out there. And my friends are off having their last fun summer before college. And it was just really isolating. I don't think teenagers know how to talk about this either, or how to support someone who's lost a parent.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think adults don't either, but but it's especially hard when you throw puberty and everything else into the fold. How old's your younger brother? Or what's the age gap, I should ask?
We're 4 years apart. So he was 13 at the time. Yeah.
So you became mom in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so similar to my mom. Me and her would always cook dinner and meals together. So that's something I enjoyed. I would take on that role. And my mom, absolutely incredible mom, rock star mom. Everyone you talk to, anyone I talked to was how did she do it all? She would do these elaborate birthday parties for us growing up. And everyone would have a themed costume and a party favor to take home. So there was a lot of ways that I understood motherhood differently because of her example of that.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways I stepped into that role. I used to pick up my brother from school a lot, but not just that. We had to go get a milkshake too. And then I had to come home and be now let's do this, very much, active. Well,
it sounds like she left you with a lot of gifts, which is really nice.
Yeah.
She did. What is some practical advice, that you could offer someone if they run into someone who's lost a parent? Let's start there. How do you have that conversation? What are things that you wanted to hear that no one told you? What are things that people said that you didn't want to hear? I think that's, a good place to start.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there's a lot of them. I kind of started doing some writing on this myself as I became a therapist, because I think, again, it's just an area a lot of people don't know about. One of the things that I'll say a lot around loss is I think one thing that's helpful is there's this outpouring of love and support at the beginning, which is amazing, right? Like I had all of my mom's siblings in town and my grandparents and people I hadn't talked to in years and a ton of support. And then it feels like that kind of dwindles after a while. So one like super practical thing I'll tell people is like if you have a close friend who's had a loved one pass away, I'll tell them like write that person's, death anniversary down in your calendar or put a reminder in your phone 6 months from now to reach out.
Yeah.
Whenever I have this happen with friends, I'll just put a reminder like, hey, reach out to Sarah in 6 months, right? Or reach out remind her on her death anniversary that you're thinking of her, or like Father's Day, Mother's Day, graduations, because part of what's hard about losing someone is like, yes, there's that grief period at the beginning, but every single time you have an accomplishment, you're like so excited and also so missing that person and wish they could be there.
Yeah.
So that's like one practical thing that I'll mention to people is like, yeah, be there at the beginning. Don't try to make it better. Don't try to be like, everything happens for a reason, or don't try to make it about you. Just sitting with somebody, asking them what they need, or just being present
sitting
with
there
them.
and being quiet with them even.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or, saying some people don't like quiet. So do you need a distraction? Right. Kind of, just being there in the ways that they need you to be there rather than the ways that are most comfortable for you.
Yeah. I think it's important. I remind, as a couples counselor, you always deal with what, doing what resonates for the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it's not your when it's your partner and it's the most intimate relationship, people still don't know what the heck to do. So asking is a big part of it. Saying, what can I do for you? Do you want me to just sit here? Or do you want me to, I can make you a meal. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's like being there. And then I think sometimes it's like just doing something.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes people are so afraid to say or do the wrong thing that they just are like, they probably have other people reaching out. They probably have other people helping them. I'm just going to lay back. And sometimes it's like, just say or do something, be willing to mess up and be willing to sit with that uncomfortability.
Yeah.
But like do whatever it takes to let that person know you're there for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible. How's it informed your practice and the way you work with others now? Do you do a lot of grief counseling, and do you do a lot of work with people who've lost parents? Or is it not a focus for you?
It hasn't been a focus as much, but it's something I definitely feel comfortable about when it comes up. Like when I have someone come in and they're like, oh, I lost this person. I'm like, all right, I feel like I know what to do. I know how to jump into this. I know how to like make sure that I bring it up in future sessions, because sometimes it feels like the rest of the world moves on and you're like, wait, I'm still back here processing this thing.
Yeah.
The interesting thing for me is what I kind of have pivoted to, and what got me interested in where I'm at now is working with family members who have working with people who have a family member who has struggled with mental illness. Right. So I end up working a lot with like children, or that's how I kind of got started. Children, spouses, siblings, all that kind of deal, who have a family member. That was like what got me into psychology. And now that has pivoted into neurodivergence and helping both neurodivergent individuals, but also a lot of times I'm working with the family members who are trying to support those individuals.
I've had a whole episode on neurodivergence, but just as a reminder, in case this is the first episode you're listening to, the way I understand it is neurodivergent essentially means your brain works a little differently. Like that's the shorthand version. So it's kind of an umbrella term for people who might have ADHD or dyspraxia, or just a, or a different disorder of some sort. Is that accurate to you, or do you have a slightly?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, that's pretty accurate to it. And, autism, tics, there's a lot of, discrepancy. Not everyone has like there's not like a set term for this, right? But a lot of times like the way that you can encompass it is just that you have your brain that works differently than other people's brains.
Yeah. You diverge from the normal brain chemistry. That's the neurodivergent. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've all run into those couples socially, whether we're in the mental health field or counseling world or coaching world or whatever, or not. Everybody kind of has run into someone who is married or has a family member that has some kind of things that are different than the rest of the population. What are some good kind of practical advice that you can give to someone who's really struggling? So someone who has a family member or even a romantic partner that deals with depression or a different kind of thing that makes it difficult to kind of have that kind of empathetic relationship.
Yeah. There's so much there, right? Because, I'm thinking about part of it is it feels like a marathon, right? You have to think about this long term. If you're in a relationship with someone who is struggling with depression or anxiety or some kind of neurodivergence, it's like thinking about the things that are going to be sustainable long term.
Yeah.
Not just what's going to work moment to moment, but how do we create sustainable practices for ourselves? How do we help understand each other's like behavior, verbals, nonverbals? How do we help understand, like, what do you need when you're in crisis? Or what do you need when you're feeling really low motivation or when you're feeling super anxious? You might have done this with your couples, but one thing that I like to do is having them check in like, hey, do you need me to listen to you right now? Do you need advice?
Yeah.
Do you need to sit in silence? Do you need a distraction?
I do it very often when you have kind of a heteronormative couple and men tend to be these problem solvers in the relationship. And I tend to train them like, you might want to ask if they want the problem solved or they just want to talk about it, so that comes up quite a bit for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think that idea though ties along with like the grief thing I was talking about too, right? It's like I've been exploring this question of like, how do we get to determine, like, who determines if something feels loving or not, right? Is it the person receiving it or the person giving it? Because the person could be doing something for you they feel like is really loving and caring, but if that's not how you feel cared for, right, you don't necessarily receive it.
Sure.
So it's like this really complex concept, especially when you bring in like parenting, right? Because sometimes it might not feel loving to the kid, but we know we're helping to set a boundary for them.
I don't think about that often as a couples counselor, but the children throws a monkey wrench. Because I would say if it's a couple who are both adults and they've had time to kind of live their life and now they're a couple, then the short answer is the receiver gets to decide if it's love, and it's, but that comes with a caveat of the onus is on them to explain if they're not feeling loved and try and redirect the behavior. And that's the part people don't have the language skills to kind of do, right? If someone washes your car for you thinking it's the greatest gift you can do because you hate washing your car, and they're like, well, I could have just paid someone $20. Like, what's the big deal? But they don't say that, then there's it falls through the cracks. But children's interesting. That's fascinating because children do not have the ability to say that's not how I want to feel. They just don't. And it's a concept that's foreign to most adults and it falls completely on deaf ears. So you kind of have to, and as a parent, you have to take on the responsibility of like, well, what kind of love language do I want them to develop,
Exactly. Yeah. And like, what am I teaching them in my interactions with them? Knowing that children are like sponges, constantly absorbing everything that they're seeing, constantly absorbing their caregivers' interactions and learning how to adapt. Yeah, it's complex.
And when I talk to people about the 5 love languages and in terms of parenting, whenever I get someone who's like really fervent and about acts of service, I like the next question out of my mouth is, did you have a single parent home? Because moms or dads that raise the kids alone don't have time to be verbally affectionate and physical affectionate often. And they're so busy just making lunches that is that the reason that you appreciate and like kind of learned love because your mom was just too busy to do anything else? And I find it's a very high, at least anecdotally, it's a very high percentage that happens.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's like, as we're talking, this is a big question I've been pondering as far as like, who gets to decide, right, if it's a loving thing or not, because I think another thing I'm thinking about is boundaries and how a lot of times setting a boundary can be a loving thing, right? You're like trying to set a boundary with like what you're able to do. But when you're able to say like, hey, I'm just not able to give that today, that can feel very not loving from your partner, right? But it is a loving thing, right? So this is like, it kind of reminds me of the parenting thing too. A lot of times you're like having to set these things that are like containing boundaries or things to keep someone safe, or to keep the relationship safe.
And with kids, we're really good. Adults aren't good at this, but parents are good about like setting time limits. I found. So like if you have one partner who's really physical and one who's not, the answer isn't to not be physical, right? The answer is like they feel like there's no end to the physicality. So it's like, well, what if you guys agreed to 10 minutes of just sitting together.
Mm-hmm.
Then the person gets something that they want, and the other person is like, only 10 minutes, I can deal with that. So there is a way to do it where everybody feels taken care of. But that takes a really mature, patient person to be able to verbalize that. That's really hard.
Yeah. And I think, like these are the things the skills that we usually learn, growing up in our families. And then we bring those skills into our older adult relationships. And it does take a lot of talking about it and like helping somebody understand why you did something and what that meant to you and how it felt for you when they said this thing and all of that. And so I think that's maybe a newer concept within parenting, is like this very slow, explaining, attuned type of parenting.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder too, when you have
we're a different generation for sure. We're like, we're in the I love you generation now, where people are overly effusive and sometimes like it's that in itself has kind of created a knee-jerk reaction in the opposite way for some kids. So
exactly. Yeah. It's just a lot different. Again, like I'm thinking about my own family of origin, and my mom, like her parents grew up in the Great Depression and her parents' family immigrated here. And so it's a very different, like the challenges that they were dealing with in the parenting styles were obviously completely different than me now, generations later.
We still have our own issues. One of the areas of study that you're fascinated with, I wanted to ask you about high masking individuals. So that's a new term for the show, and I'm going to take the floor and kind of define what it is and what fascinates you about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So when we talk about masking, it's usually a term used within neurodivergent communities to talk about the things that people do to try to fit in with neurotypical people socially. So it's usually a term, masking is like a social term that we use. So there's this book that's wonderful that I talk to people about all the time called Unmasking Autism. It's by Devin Price. I really hope I got the last name right on that.
I'll look it up.
Okay, thanks. I was just about to.
Autism?
Unmasking Autism.
I recommend it. Unmasking.
Unmasking.
Yeah, it's Devin Price.
Okay, perfect. Yep. I second guessed myself for a second.
PhD,
so
for sure.
Yeah, everyone should definitely check it out. Explores a lot of these concepts, but the idea with masking is that people will create this way of being socially so that they can be more successful socially. So at work, maybe hand flapping or, shaking your leg or doing some of these more erratic behaviors, stimming as we might call it. If you do that in your workplace, you're going to be looked at as weird or off, or it's not professional. And I'm putting that in air quotes, which people won't be able to see. So the idea is people tend to mask some of those behaviors. And then the high masking individuals is people who usually have become very adept at masking. Another way that I kind of think about this is people who tend to be highly productive. So people who have pretty severe struggles with their either autism, depression, anxiety, whatever it is, right? So that part of it feels very severe to them, but they are also highly productive. They're able to... And part of what we're getting into is like the medical model of how we determine care is usually determined by functioning. So we'll say, are you able to function at work, at home, in these different contexts? Yeah. And we have an idea of what that means. So we say like, okay, you're doing all those things. Great. You're good. Versus like, what's their normal level of functioning and what are they at now?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where the high masking comes in. I kind of think about it as people who are able to be socially successful, able to be highly productive. But that doesn't necessarily negate the severity of their struggle with whatever.
Yeah, I mean, for you and me, it might be really simple to get on a podcast and have a conversation over Zoom or you record it. But someone who has some disorder or some kind of neurodivergence that makes this as painful as going and getting like a root canal, and you don't see what's going on behind the surface, right? That anguish is still living inside of them, and like, they're spent. I mean, I had another therapist I had on here that talked about neurodivergence. She said, when I go to the grocery store and I come back, I'm done for the day. There's just so many choices to make. There's music playing. There's really bright lights. She's like, it's too much. I can't handle it.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to kind of growing that empathy in the culture and kind of, you know, teaching people to ask those questions. I think it's a really good step in the right direction.
Right. Well, we look at successful individuals and we say, well, they can't possibly be struggling in some way, right? They couldn't possibly be neurodivergent. They're highly successful, rather than a lot of times there's people who are highly successful and able to mask very highly,
Right.
And also still struggling pretty significantly.
So fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Maddie, I want to first of all thank you for being so, you know, open and like an open book, really, about your past, and brave about sharing your, you know, those painful memories of your past, and kind of for the betterment of everybody. That's really very touching that you're so giving and generous in that way. And thank you for kind of inspiring me to go read a new great book that I haven't heard of. So I appreciate it. And just thank you for coming here and sharing your time and your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I think it's important to do. It's stuff I've obviously processed, and that's the only reason I'm able to share it, is because I've done a lot of the work to process it in therapy and to write about it and to share about it on other places. And so I think, suicide in particular is really important for us to get more comfortable talking about, even just like saying the word out loud and having more conversation about it.
If someone wants to work with you directly or learn more about you, where can they go to find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at Mady, MADY, at spacestherapyla.com. So the practice I'm at a group practice right now, which is Spaces Therapy LA. There's a website as well that we have, spacestherapyla.com. So you can find me there, connect with me there, reach out via email. I love connecting with people. That's the best way to get connected to me.
Awesome. And I'll put that information in the show notes. If you're listening, you can kind of revisit it that way.
That would be great. Yeah, I'd love to connect with whoever hears this and resonates with it in any way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again. If you're interested in learning how to get the absolute most out of your romantic relationships, then you're in luck, because I have put together a free workshop, or masterclass, if you will, about 3 secrets that people in happy relationships have discovered. You can view the workshop at mrspirituality.com/3 secrets. Again, it's completely free. Just go there and watch it. It'll help you on your journey, give you some wisdom, some things to think about. The website again is mrspirituality.com/3 secrets. That's mrspirituality.com/3, the word secrets. It's all yours. Enjoy.